the question that diplomats have to ask themselves is, what is diplomacy 202? What is unorthodox diplomacy? How do you get heard in a world before you get punished? How do you put on your armory so that you are not insulted in the White House? How do you prepare so this is a completely different thing. How do you run with trade deals so that you take the insults in the White House? How do you speak truth to lies when you are shown that? Mass graves that you know is in the DRC and not in South Africa. How do you do that?
Hello and welcome. Welcome to part 2 of our interesting conversation with the former South African ambassador to the US, Ibrahim Rasool, who talked very candidly about his experience as a diplomat in Washington, D.C., some of the issues he faced. He talked about Cyril Ramaphosa's visit to the White House as president of South Africa. And now, in part 2, he reveals why some of these issues are so important to him. Now, I was going to ask you a bit about domestic politics because the ANC has always been known as the leading party, pretty much unchallenged until more recently. And now, of course, there's the GNU, the Government of National Unity. Considering what's been going on in the fractions occurring within South African politics, is it time for a rethink for the ANC?
If the ANC hasn't started rethinking 5 years ago, then the ANC will deserve what the voters continue doing to it. It will be a tragedy for South Africa if the ANC were ever to become irrelevant in the politics of South Africa, because the glue that held not just the nation together, but that kept at bay black rage and kind of white complacency was the ANC. And so the point of the matter is, if we lose that, we lose the fabric of our society. But the ANC will be able to blame no one else. It produced a Jacob Zuma. It was patient through a decade almost of state capture. It was very slow in renewing the ANC once it got rid of Jacob Zuma. It overthought, how do we deal with the people inside the ANC? It may have confused the fact that a decisive blow against corruption could increase your fortunes amongst the electorate versus a slow kind of massaging of the internal forces as the way to keep the internal coalition of the ANC together. So I think that for me is the danger to the ANC. It's overthinking, it's overcaution, and its inability to deal a decisive blow. It had Jacob Zuma in prison, and then there was a pardon. Now, there are prices to pay for it, and sometimes you must choose at what moment you pay the price.
That's the sense I got, that glue that you describe is being dissolved by the fact the ANC has split along the lines, factions that are pro-Zuma, pro-Ramaphosa, you know, and that you have that kind of fairly serious division. How can you unite the ANC again?
I think that the ANC has to decide where does it take and how does it take its punishment. It can go the slow death route, in which first the EFF goes out and takes away 10% and then, or 7%, and then along comes MK party of Jacob Zuma, and they take away another percent, and then you're down to 40%, etc. Or it can say, let's risk a glorious death with a possibility that we get a glorious resuscitation. And the glorious death will be, let's cut the umbilical cord with anyone who has been corrupt in the ANC. And then rebuild our trust that we have with the electorate, and give the electorate something to rally around, a clean moral party, rather than living a whimpering life.
One of the complications I would guess you have is that you and a lot of those who have witnessed the pre-apartheid era so personally are of a generation of generations that think in a particular way. But then you have a younger generation, which, for example, the FF Economic Freedom Fighters of Julius Malema, he was ANC youth before, they appeal to the younger generations.
And I think that is always going to be the case, and that's why it was always important to have a youth league in the ANC that kind of socializes the next generations. And in socializing, you give them a true nature of what struggle is. It's organization, it's mobilization, it's campaigns. Secondly, you give them a benchmark of suffering. Suffering isn't when you can't get a BMW. Suffering isn't when you can't wear Gucci's. Suffering isn't when you don't have a Breitling watch, etc. And therefore, the calibration of suffering is that we now have taps in every house, whereas before we had one child designated to fetch water from the river rather than go to school. That we now don't have candles in the house, you flip a switch and you've got a light in the house. You see, that's the fundamental changes. That if you're 60 and over, you get a pension every month, whereas before you didn't because you were black. That you can now learn math and science, before it was prohibited in your curriculum. So you see, once you make post-apartheid things too normal, you don't have a reverence for a history of your parents where none of that was available. And so we need to socialize people into this history of apartheid. And so we're so busy teaching technical things, which we must, that we have forgotten to refresh their memory.
Presumably, though, you have to be careful. You don't lecture to the degree where the young close their ears and say, la, 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 we don't want to know. We see the rest of the world moving a particular way.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's why history, being a history teacher myself, doesn't have to be boring. It has to be experiential. You've got to invest in the hard drive of the country. You cannot say, for example, we are putting all our money into bread and butter, but you don't build the sites of memorialization. You don't have a proper memory that captures the massacres and the education museum about what was the curriculum before.
And then ultimately you have to present South Africa, sort all this out, so you can present South Africa as a unified country so that it can attract foreign investors, it can show its position in the world in a stronger way, surely.
I don't think that those are mutually exclusive objectives. How you refresh the memory of our young people, how you put bread and butter on the table, and how you compete in the world. And I think that South Africa does have the infrastructure, for example, for education. It has the kind of electronic infrastructure where our young people transact on their cell phones and become entrepreneurs. I just think that, that has been an advantage for us over many years, that our banking knowledge, our banks are the best, our justice system is the best, etc., etc. I just think that we are not clicking it together into one unified strategy as our presentation to the world.
I'm going to move on to your career as a diplomat and some of the smart things people have said. You have said a couple of quotes based on diplomacy. You've said diplomacy is not the art of lying, but it's the art of telling the truth gently and constructively. Diplomacy is not flattery or denial, but it's persuasion based on intellectual honesty and integrity. Diplomacy is not the abandonment of your core values, but it is about universalizing them for a better world. And diplomacy is not sacrificing your interests, but it's about pursuing them with dignity. How has diplomacy changed since your early years?
So, orthodox diplomacy meant that diplomats studied the Vienna Convention, they were taught the Vienna Convention, there was a way in which you did things, and there was a language that you spoke, there was a strong foundation of civility in all of that. And so navigating the gentleness in your diplomacy, the truth-telling in your diplomacy, navigating how to secure your values while advancing your interests, those were the kind of stuff that made my first stint as a diplomat really exciting. How did I do that with the kind of Obama administration? I think in this round, the rules were gone. In this round, you were punished without being demarched, called in for an explanation. Your note verbals, when you say to Secretary Rubio, can my Minister of International Relations call you for 2 minutes to congratulate you on being appointed? And they don't respond to it, but you hear on a tweet that they're not going to talk to us. And so forth. When they don't pitch up at the G20 without explanation, and after you inquire through note verbals about it, you read on a tweet that we won't go there because South Africa's leadership of the G20 is based on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's why we won't go. When the one who steps into you at a low level is then prohibited from posing for the family photo, and to her credit, resigns after that. So I'm saying that this is a world of fundamental incivility. And therefore, the question that diplomats have to ask themselves is, what is diplomacy 202? What is unorthodox diplomacy? How do you get heard in a world before you get punished? How do you put on your armory so that you are not insulted in the White House? How do you prepare so this is a completely different thing. How do you run with trade deals so that you take the insults in the White House? How do you speak truth to lies when you are shown that mass graves that you know is in the DRC and not in South Africa? How do you do that?
Has Trump invented a new form of diplomacy in this way, or has brinkmanship essentially been at the core of it, even if it was more subtle?
I don't think that anything that Donald Trump does is diplomatic. I think it's all brinkmanship. And we were very good going into the USA, believing that transactionality was the critical language to speak. And we were prepared for that. We read The Art of the Deal, we tried to understand, we tried to divine his mind and so forth. But he's essentially capricious. He's essentially unpredictable. He is essentially mood-driven. Some of our diplomats joked, we said, he's like the cushion pillow. He's going to speak based on the impression the last person left on him. And so the point of the matter is, you cannot prepare a diplomatic path. For that, you've got to be at the height of your wits. And I think the fact that I was able to do what I call an encircling strategy. I did the business associations. Then I moved towards the think tanks. Then I got through 22 doors of Congress and Senate in an encircling strategy, and then clinched at the last White House. And it was based on really trying to change the atmosphere around the president, as opposed to trying to change the mind of the president. And I think we succeeded in doing that. So when someone tells me, a senator from the MAGA says, you're too close to China, get rid of your relationship with China, then you can speak. Then I said, Senator, you know, you pointing a shotgun at South Africa's knees, threatening to kneecap us, but you first want us to throw away our crutches. Then the senator, when he sees the image, he laughs. He says, I can see what you mean. So the point is, that's the kind of disarming that you have to do as you move towards the White House.
So I was going to ask you, is there anything about Donald Trump's style of diplomacy? You said he's not a diplomat, so is there anything you like about his non-diplomacy?
I think that, believe me, I predicted that if the Global South agenda and the G20 agenda of South Africa is realized in two important ways. One, that we can reform the global architecture for the United Nations and the World Bank. There is only one maverick that can do it, and that is Donald Trump. Because the absence of diplomacy could be resulting in the fact that he has no holy cows. He's loyal to nothing. Unlike Biden, Biden is loyal to all those institutions, and therefore you can't expect a Biden to reform those institutions or to subvert those institutions. But here is a man who has, his incivility is so universal. His capriciousness is so universal that if you want that kind of reform of the global architecture done, he may be the man who could do it, and therefore you've got to compete for who sits last on that cushion.
So early on, the twist is early on in his first term, he used the term holes for, I'm trying not to get bleeped here, for many African countries. Do you think he takes Africa seriously in any way?
I think he's taking Africa seriously now, because the fundamental method in the madness in the USA is that the USA has fallen behind in the scramble for critical minerals. You see, there's no accident that Donald Trump in his inauguration was surrounded by the tech barons, starting with Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc. All of them know that what will define this moment in the fourth industrial revolution is the access to critical minerals. They've identified, they now have a critical mineral czar in the White House. That's how important it is. They've identified 50 critical minerals that the USA needs in the short term if it is not to be overrun by China in the technological race. Of that, 12 of those 50, the US is 100% dependent on other countries. For 29, 50% dependent on other countries. And for 13 of them, absolutely dependent on China, either through China's providing it or China processing it. So this thing about Greenland sounds mad, but Greenland is the access to the melting ice where critical minerals may be available in the Arctic. The joke about Panama, the US never wants to be in a situation where the passage between the Pacific and the Atlantic is closed. The bombing of Houthis, that the Indian and the Atlantic Ocean must never be held hostage again. So Africa has 30% of the world's critical minerals, and South Africa, 80% of the world's platinum critical minerals. So is Africa taken seriously? The moment of absolute aggression against South Africa came when South Africa lost 18 soldiers in the eastern DRC to M23, believed to be a proxy of Rwanda, believed to be a proxy. We lost 18 soldiers in defense of the critical minerals of the DRC. Once South Africa withdrew its forces, the United States came into the DRC and have signed the deal now for how to harness the critical minerals of the DRC. So if Africa is important, it is because it is critical for critical minerals.
You know, that you've mentioned the role of China, and I wonder, with South Africa's position in the world today, the growing BRICS alliance and so on, is it possible there are these new economic alliances might help redress this Western dominance up to now? Do you see a realignment on the global stage to the degree that South Africa could benefit from this?
Part of the reason that South Africa is in the crosshairs is because South Africa finds itself at a very interesting place in the global architecture. It is in BRICS, it is in the non-aligned movement, it is central to the African Union, it is the president of the G20, and so South Africa finds itself wherever the counterbalance to Western domination is being born. At this moment, there is a multipolarity developing, just more poles in the world around which to organize the world. It is not yet of the capacity for what I would call multilateralism, the ability to do what you want to. So there's no, America fears it, that this multipolarity will express its multilateralism through, for example, de-dollarization, getting off the dollar system. I don't think even China is ready for that. We can experiment. If I buy oil from Saudi Arabia, I pay them in rand. When they buy meat from South Africa, they pay us in rial. We can do those kind of things. But the fact of the matter is, the world isn't ready for de-dollarization. But that would be a warning bell in the US that if this multipolarity develops further, it could lead to that. It could lead to intra-global South deals. South Africa sends all its platinum for processing to China, and the US has to buy it so that they can manufacture cars in the US. So it could deal with those kind of things. So what I'm saying in short is that there is a multipolarity developing. It is not yet of the capacity for multilateralism, but the US is anticipating those kind of possibilities and therefore needs to resolve a few issues before then.
So, you know, in that respect, I guess South Africa's sudden presence with the ICJ filing would show that these other nations are willing to stand up now. What did that ICJ filing by South Africa do against the genocide case against Israel? What did it do for South Africa's standing?
I think South Africa emerged at that moment not as an economic or military superpower, but certainly as a moral superpower in the world. That it was able to take a step, taking Israel to the ICJ, which potentially could be, as it may be proving now, to be against its interests. And particularly when, in a sense, you jeopardize your interests in order to advance core values, core solidarities with the Palestinians, and stirs the conscience of the world, then I think it is threatening to those who have nurtured an impunity in Israel. And so what happened out of that is that South Africa, through its interim ruling that it got from the International Court of Justice, where 14 of the 15 judges said they may have something to answer for on the genocide. The signs are there. Suddenly, the narrative that all history in the Middle East started on the 7th of October 2023, that narrative fell apart. That people saw the beginning of the movie, they saw that moment in the movie, and they could also now predict how the movie was going to end through the depopulation of the Palestinians, the increasing of settlements, the demilitarized zones that will squeeze the Palestinians and Gaza into one corner, the disabling of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the taking of land. That's how the movie is going to end. It may not end with a two-state solution even. So, but the fact is, South Africa intervening at this critical moment in the plot showed the whole movie. And the fact is that that stirred the conscience, not just of the campuses in the US and the streets in the US and all over the world, but even young Jewish people who may not any longer have a grandmother or a grandfather who was physically in Auschwitz. And they could now think with their conscience and say, I'm Jewish, I enjoy being Jewish, I want to be Jewish, I may even love Israel, but I will not give a blank check to Netanyahu to achieve the end game that he has in mind. So I think South Africa stirred the conscience of the world, and when Ireland and Spain join South Africa, then you know that you are breaking the consensus that has, the guilt consensus that has carefully built up in the Western world.
So I'm going to quote you here where you said, withdrawing from the International Court of Justice is not an option until Palestine is free and Israel is accountable. And though you've seen that support, as you said, how much pressure is South Africa facing with this issue ongoing?
I think that we've already paid with all our aid. I think we're already slapped with 30% tariffs. And we can say it's part of the generality of the world, but there was something visceral about how South Africa was narrativized in all of it. Terrible things are happening there. They're doing a genocide. We were pilloried in the world like no other country. Mexico was just slapped with tariffs. Canada was just slapped with tariffs. In our case, the narrative had to be particularly horrible. And that was particularly to break down South Africa's moral authority. You don't have the moral authority to take our ally Israel to the International Court of Justice. That is why the language against South Africa was so visceral.
Do you see progress in people's perspective? You said there are younger generation Jewish people who may love Israel but say, look, I won't give a blank check to Netanyahu. But, you know, there are those analysts who say that, and Jewish and Israeli actually, who say that the term anti-Semitism is becoming weaponized in order to be the standard argument against what they see as Zionism. Do you see progress in the way the world is thinking?
You know, starting at a different point, we had to warn in South Africa the weaponization of the term racist. When populists use racist labels or labels of racism and racists to justify why they didn't get a job, why they didn't win this, why they didn't win that, then we know that they are weaponizing something sacred in what went down in the history of South Africa, and that we should never be able to allow that term to be weaponized in that way. So we acted against that by education and by prohibiting hate speech in our Constitution. I think if Jewish consensus does not salvage the notion of anti-Semitism, prevent it from being weaponized, and stop it from becoming the fig leaf for Israeli atrocity, then they are in danger of sullying the memory of the 6 million who died in the Holocaust, because they are taking a sacred memory and putting it at the service of a government in Israel to protect atrocities by that government and to cover up for a genocide in the name of the 6 million people. And therefore, every community must not be preached from without to stop the weaponization of the notion anti-Semitism. It has to be an intra-Jewish debate in honor of the memory of those who have truly died at the hands of anti-Semitic tyrants in the world.
As a Muslim, I want to get your perspective on the way Islamophobia started to grow in many places, especially post 9/11. Where do you think things stand now for the Muslim world in general?
I think that Islamophobia is a phenomenon that is now admitted. You can now Google the spelling of Islamophobia and find the word. Find the word, whereas up till 5 years ago, it was not to be found in Google or Chrome or whatever the case may be. So it is now a word. It's been a hard fought for word to enter. And I come from a Muslim community that had the height of Islamophobia. Muslims were enslaved in colonial South Africa, and Islam as a religion was banned in colonial South Africa, and under apartheid it was declared a false faith. So that is Islamophobia. So I often say this to people so that they don't confuse the slight, every slight against a Muslim, as an act of Islamophobia, because we must bear in mind the fundamental notion of a discrimination, which is a bigotry, which is a power relationship. So for me, I will forgive someone who comes to me with a prejudice, because all that they've learned about Islam, they may have learned from Osama bin Laden. So I must understand that that prejudice by them must be diffused. But they don't have that, so they may have their right to a prejudice because we may have presented Islam in a problematic way, in a violent way. They may have learned it in their textbooks. So I must be able to forgive a prejudice, but I can never forgive a discrimination, because the discrimination is the ability to turn an inert prejudice into a powerful act of exclusion, of humiliation against you. So those are the kind of very important nuances that we need in this world today, whether for Islamophobia, whether for anti-Semitism, whether for racism. And so the world needs a conversation about back to those kind of basics so that we get it right.
You're creating parallels basically between the terms anti-Semitism and anti.
They're all children of one family. Yeah. The family surname is bigotry. Ignorance and fear are the first generation, and prejudice and discrimination is the second generation. And then you've got all these children running wild.
And I know you, as a Muslim, have tried very hard to create a greater understanding and to fight Islamophobia as well. In fact, Nelson Mandela praised you on it. What did Madiba say to you? No,
Madiba found it very counter-instinctive that a global community that often isolates because its theology could be isolationist in the wrong hands. It often excludes itself because its theology in the wrong hands says stay away from anyone who doesn't believe, eat like us, pray like us, and dress like us, and so forth. So he found it very strange that we formed an organization called the Call of Islam. Its first acts in its quest for liberation in South Africa was to affiliate to the United Democratic Front, which was the internal liberation movement, and its second act was to affiliate to Desmond Tutu's interfaith movement. Because we did the counter-instinctive. We inserted ourselves with our identities, and in fact, I think, enriched the whole of the struggle, the whole of the interfaith movement, with a perspective of Islam and Muslims that I think, by its example, combated the historical Islamophobia that was there. I challenge, for example, American Muslims who do face Islamophobia. My son gets held up for 2 hours at Dallas International Airport because of his name and his religion. He's seconded every time. I get seconded when I don't have a diplomatic passport. So the fact of the matter is, I tell them that the best way to fight Islamophobia against Muslims is to join the struggle against racism by finding touch points with Black Lives Matter, for example, so that we show that all bigotries are related. So we've got to do the count, and that's what Nelson Mandela recognized, the ability of my generation to do the counter-instinctive.
Moving on to the G20 now, then, you've got South Africa as the chair. What are the main benefits for South Africa?
I think that, first, the main burden for South Africa is that South Africa completes 4 years of global South leadership, starting with Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa. So the global South had been building up for a reform of the global architecture, issues like debt, issues like development, just energy transitions, etc. The challenge for South Africa is that we hand over the chairperson or the presidency of the G20 to President Trump.
That's right.
And so that's the challenge. The burden is we've got to complete a job of the global South. The challenge is we've got to hand it over to Donald Trump. So South Africa has to decide, in a sense, whether its presidency, under these very unpredictable, difficult geopolitical circumstances, whether it salvages a few things that it runs with, or whether it tries to push through that agenda and give it to Donald Trump, whether Trump will even be there to receive it. Those are the imponderables for South Africa. And so if I were South Africa, I'd understand that I'm probably in a holding operation. The big systemic changes won't be made. Maybe out of the global financial architecture, we can get some debt relief. Maybe out of that, we can get the 19 of the 20 to invest in making up some of the aid that was lost as a result of the actions by the 20th member. I think South Africa needs to see how much of that agenda it can complete, seduce Donald Trump to come and take up the chain, find him on a day that he may be maverick enough to take on the global architecture. I think it's a very unpredictable year for South Africa.
A day when the cushions had time to recover, yeah? So I'm going to quote you here on that. You said, our friends are mighty in the G20, but they're also the downtrodden, the oppressed, and the occupied. Do you feel Donald Trump is trying to bully the G20?
I think he's trying to take over the presidency of the G20 on his terms. We don't yet know what it is. But if, for example, he thinks that the G20 is going to be the place, another site of struggle in his trade war, if he thinks that this is going to be his platform to lord it over the G20, he could have one of two reactions. He could either have acquiescence, that people sit him out, or they go along with him, or he might just be able to translate America first into America alone. Because the G19 may well say, listen, if we sit out next year, let us act on an agenda that I think gives us strength in the trade war and in the face of this kind of bullying from the United States.
Is it essential that he attend, that the US attend?
As President Ramaphosa said, we don't want to hand over the leadership to an empty chair. Because that's what it is. It could either mean that he sends someone else to receive it, or it means that it could be the end of the G20. If it's like disqualification in a relay race. If the baton is dropped, or if the runner refuses to run, you have disqualification. So that really would be the kind of options available to us.
Personally, do you think he will come or not?
I think he has enough of a sense of the grandness of the occasion. If vanity is a driving force for him, there is nothing more vainglorious than coming to say, I am now the president of the G20. So I think we should work with that instinct rather than anything else.
To wrap up the last part of our wonderful conversation, Ambassador, let's bring it back to South Africa's relationship with the USA. Where do you believe things stand now, overall?
South Africa's relationship with the USA has always been at three levels. We've always had troubled relations with its executive, its White House, who basically see South Africa's allies, whether it's Fidel Castro and whether it's Yasser Arafat, and then thought that they could lecture to Nelson Mandela about who his friend should be, and Nelson Mandela told them where to get off. So we've always had that one. Reagan never wanting to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. So we've had a troubled relationship at the White House. We've had 50-50 relations with Congress and Senate. It took until 2008 for Congress to remove Nelson Mandela from the terrorist list. 2008. But there were glorious moments in which, led even by Republicans, they overturned Reagan's veto and passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. So it's a 50-50 thing. But we've always had wonderful relations with the people of the United States. Those were the people who refused to eat our oranges, who refused to unload our ships, who refused to have anything to do with South Africa. And whether it was Danny Glover, the actor, whether it was even disputed as it is, Bill Cosby having on his fridge boycott apartheid for his shows, the musicians, etc. So, and you see, that's what frightens a Donald Trump. That South Africa is actually the one country with a constituency in the United States. That when South Africa does something, like for example, the case against Israel, it does find echo because South Africa has been a moral beacon for ordinary Americans. So, all in all, it is Congress that decides a goer. It is the executive and the administration that decides on trade. And so we can create a pressure from the bottom, but we've got to do smart negotiating in the middle. And the negotiations has to be based not on, oh, we're so poor, please help us. It has to be based on the fact that says, this is our leverage. We have 600 US companies, they're making enormous profits, and if you impose these tariff and trade restrictions on us, they suffer. That we have 80% of the world's platinum. Every car needs platinum for its catalytic converters, and if you want our platinum, then we negotiate this deal. So I think and then, believe it or not, to say we have 20 South African companies in the USA. They employ thousands of Americans, and if you do this, it will have an adverse effect on how Sasol is able to bring in its feedstock, and if you put tariffs on that, then 10,000 Americans lose their livelihoods in Louisiana. So I think we've got to become hard-nosed. That's the language of transactionality. We'll not win the language of values. Let that narrative go. The world knows who's the adult and who's not, who's the liar and who's not. But the fact is, if we don't go in there knowing what our leverages are, we'll be eaten for breakfast.
Just to throw in a personal anecdote involving Nelson Mandela because of what you just said. Back in '97 when I interviewed him, he had just met with Muammar Gaddafi, who was president of Libya at the time, and he had a big backlash in the media because of that. And when I asked him how he reacted to the fact he had such negative press in the West about meeting Muammar Gaddafi, his words, the line stuck in my head. I've got it recorded somewhere. I will not have anyone tell me who my friends are.
Absolutely.
So that's exactly what you said, he said.
Absolutely.
I wonder, who represents South Africa in DC now, considering what happened to you?
I think that we have what is called the chargé. It is the one who would have been my deputy. He is the chargé d'affaires. The president has, I think wisely, withheld the naming of a successor, but has in the interim put in place a special envoy who I think is facing challenges of his own because no one who has ever tasted white supremacy in South Africa can withhold themselves from telling the truth about who they're seeing. So he's facing those challenges. And so, in a sense, the way in which presidents come in and out of Washington by themselves, it appears as if those moments in the White House are very important for Trump and kind of eliminates. So ambassadors do the footwork, but the big scene is in very kind of direct relations with that. So I think that South Africa doesn't need to tempt a kind of rejection at this moment by the USA. South Africa must certainly not allow the USA to choose our ambassador for us. And already you're coming with those kind of, we don't choose their ambassador even if we were to find him or her very odious. But the US must not choose our ambassador.
What are you doing now as such then? What is your day-to-day job?
So I basically have returned to my foundation, which is called the World for All Foundation. And I think I do a lot of my work through there. I'm considering what my next step would be. There are quite a few offers about how I can do my work. But I think, for example, the World for All Foundation has been invited to make a contribution to Syria's rebuilding through the idea of what models of statecraft are available if you don't want to be Islamist. What's the middle line between a kind of Islamist model, a dictatorial model, or a outright Western democracy? There must be. And so the World for All has built up some of those kind of expertises.
Now, having been declared persona non grata by the US Secretary of State, are you able to return to America?
No, they've also revoked my my travel visa, my tourist visa, and which was expected.
Under a better circumstance, if there was the opportunity to return to that diplomatic post, is it something you'd be interested in doing?
No, I don't think so. I think I've now, it was already quite a big decision about whether I should go the second time. I did it out of a sense of national duty rather than burning ambition. I'm not a career diplomat, so I don't think so.
Do you wear that persona non grata badge with honor, or is it disgrace?
No, absolutely. It's an honor wherever I'm going. I think that it says there was one ambassador who stood up and didn't take the BS. It says that there's one who had the courage to stand by the values, and so I think that for me it's absolutely a badge of honor.
So, Ambassador, no regrets?
No regrets, absolutely.
Thank you for being so kind with your time. I know you're unemployed technically, but still. Good to give us the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
All the best. Nice seeing you again.
Thank you, sir. Fascinating insights there from the former South African ambassador to the USA, Ibrahim Rasool. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. Do give us your comments and feedback and subscribe to the show, and I'll see you soon.